Statler discuss her case, her presentation.
Good morning. So I'd like to thank the ASH Organizing Committee for giving me the opportunity to present our research entitled Are Racial Disparities in Acute Myeloid Leukemia Clinical Trial Enrollment Associated with Comorbidities and/or Organ Dysfunction? So accrual data suggests that minority patient populations are underrepresented in cancer clinical trials. Overly restrictive eligibility criteria may be an important barrier to enrollment among minority patient populations, as these criteria are biased toward fit patient populations and potentially discriminate against those who have comorbidities. This then raises the question, are specific subpopulations of patients systematically excluded from clinical trials because of the way in which eligibility criteria are designed? This may indeed be the case for African Americans, as African Americans compared to whites have higher rates of comorbidities and report poorer overall health. However, the relationship between comorbidity and organ dysfunction exclusion criteria and minority recruitment to AML clinical trials is not well understood. Therefore, we aim to determine if African Americans are more likely to be excluded from clinical trials based upon typical eligibility criteria because of their comorbidity profile, and to compare comorbidities to determine if comorbidities are associated with clinical outcomes. So our full cohort included 1,040 patients. Baseline characteristics, which included age, sex, etiology, and ELN risk, were well balanced between African Americans and whites. African Americans were also just as likely as whites to receive intensive chemotherapy. The only demographic variable that was significantly different between the two groups was insurance. So African Americans were more likely to have Medicaid insurance, while white patients were more likely to have private insurance. All other organ function results, as well as comorbidities, were similar between African Americans and whites, with the exception of kidney function. So when we examined pre-treatment creatinine data, and creatinine is a measure of your kidney function, we found that white patients were more likely to have normal creatinine results, while African Americans were more likely to have abnormal creatinine results. Not shown here are the creatinine clearance data, which follow a similar trend. So again, white patients were more likely to have normal creatinine clearance results, while African Americans were more likely to have abnormal creatinine clearance results, and these differences were statistically significant. However, when we examined the relationship between renal function and overall survival, we found that patients that had mild creatinine elevation, and again, creatinine is a measure of your kidney function, they had similar overall survival to those without such abnormalities. Now, as the creatinine levels continued to escalate, we did start to see differences in survival that were statistically significant, as demonstrated here by the orange and the red bar. When we examined the creatinine clearance data, a similar pattern emerged that's not shown here, but again, patients who had minor creatinine clearance abnormalities had similar overall survival to those without such abnormalities. However, as the abnormality did continue to become more severe, survival differences, which were significant, began to emerge. So the key findings from this study are that renal function eligibility criteria may indeed be an important barrier to clinical trial enrollment for African Americans. So across our full cohort, 56% of the patients presented with a renal function abnormality. However, this proportion was higher among African Americans, 63% of which presented with a renal function abnormality that could have potentially excluded them from a clinical trial. However, our outcomes suggest that renal function is not associated with clinical outcomes. Therefore, these data allow us to provide recommendations regarding how future clinical trials may design eligibility criteria. So we specifically recommend liberalizing renal function eligibility criteria, as this might promote the recruitment of African Americans to AML clinical trials. So the implications of this work are really threefold. The first is, if we're able to liberalize renal function eligibility criteria, then this may reduce racial disparities in clinical trial enrollment. This might be a major step in improving the diversity of cancer patient populations. Secondly, if more minority patients are eligible for clinical trials, we might be able to reduce the inequitable access to investigational products, which may allow a more diverse patient population to potentially benefit from novel therapies, which is extraordinarily important in the context of a life-threatening disease such as AML. And finally, if we're able to liberalize eligibility criteria in a way that promotes the recruitment of minority patient populations, then the outcomes from these clinical trials will be more applicable to a diverse array of cancer patients, particularly those who have been underrepresented in cancer clinical trial patient populations over the last several decades.
Thank you, Dr. Statler. So we'll next have Dr. Nilanjan Ghosh.